Hey YouTube, today I'm going to be doing a video tutorial on how to maintain the auger drive protection system on your snowblower. And the protection system is essentially that left bolt and that right bolt on the augers. And basically those are low strength shear bolts that are intended to snap in the event that the augers, either the left or the right, strike a stationary object. So the whole purpose of that and why it's important is that that drive shaft that comes out of that gearbox is a hardened steel and it's rotating with a lot of torque because it's got to break up your snow. Well, if that jams or that side jams, then what's the give to protect that gearbox, which costs a lot of money to replace? Well, nothing. And so the idea of what manufacturers have done is that they designed those shear bolts or pins to break so that that drive shaft inside the auger core can keep rotating even if you end up jamming that auger with a lot of ice or something. And so you want to make sure that that protection system is always working. And what I found with a lot of old snowblowers, including a Honda 928 that I had owned, that the previous owners either don't know or don't bother coating that hardened drive shaft that passes through this auger with any type of AntiSeize lubricant or grease, and of course rust sets in, which then fuses the drive shaft and auger together, negating the usefulness of those shear bolts. And so we want to make sure that on any snowblower where you have the ability to remove that auger off the drive shafts, that we maintain them at least on a yearly basis to ensure that those shear pins work as they're intended. So before we actually do any disconnecting work inside the auger housing, we actually were to remove the auger retaining bolts located on each side of the blower. And basically this is just holding that bearing piece into the inner plate in our blower housing. And so we want to make sure we take this off first because it's actually easier to undo it now with everything sort of locked in place than to try to undo this with everything unbolted where it spins freely. Let's repeat the same for the other side. So once we remove the bearing end cap bolts, the next thing that's got to come out is the impeller drive shaft bolt, and that's a 12mm shear bolt and nut that takes power from the impeller and puts it into the auger drive gearbox here. So we're just going to undo this using a wrench and a 12mm socket. Once you take this off, pull it out and keep your parts together. Next, we want to remove the two shear bolts, one on each side of the auger gearbox, by taking a 10mm socket and loosening the bolts. Now, much like how we took off the impeller bolts, use another 10mm wrench to hold the bolt in place. So this is what our shear bolt and nut look like once we've pulled it off of the auger and the auger shaft. And although it looks like just your standard run-of-the-mill 10mm bolt, it actually in fact is a de-strengthened bolt. I think it's a hardness number 3, which is actually a very soft metal that's designed to break when a sufficient amount of force has been applied to it. Now you have to remember that the auger gearbox, the drive shaft, spins all the time when the auger clutches engage, and then of course the auger, right, so the black part slips over this, and then the bolt sort of makes them rotate together. But what happens is that if you hit a stationary object with your auger, that places a tremendous amount of shock and stress on the gear drive. And I mean, we've got a 6 horsepower engine here with a lot of torque driving all of this, that the gears inside of this gearbox are no match for that type of horsepower, especially at the rate of speed that they spin at. And so if you hit something like a frozen newspaper or a piece of wood, this is supposed to shear, break, and then allow your augers to spin freely or not spin while the drive shaft inside the augers continue to spin freely. Now, the whole reason why I want to put AntiSeize on the insides of these auger output shafts is to ensure that over the years that I'll have the snowblower, and in at least most snowblowers and especially Hondas, they last forever. I've seen some as old as 30 years old, where the rust and water and salt and everything get in these little holes and in between the drive shaft and the auger assembly, which then causes it to rust together. And then, of course, when things are all rusted together, regardless of whether or not you actually have a shear bolt installed, that when you hit a stationary object, that shear pin won't break, and then everything gets destroyed anyways. So we're just going to do the same thing here for the opposite side. So I'll remove this next one. So now that we've disconnected our auger and everything on the inside of the blower housing, we're going to go ahead and now remove the sort of the end bearing plate on both sides of the snowblower. Now with everything unbolted, we can just grab the gearbox and support it with our one hand, and then just carefully pull forward, taking care not to scratch the insides of your blower housing, because that can make it rust. And this is sort of what it looks like once it's been pulled. So to apply our AntiSeize onto the auger and auger drive shaft unit, we're just going to carefully here pull off the end bearing, which should just slide right off like this. And then if your snowblower is as new as mine, or you've previously lubed it, you can just kind of support this gearbox, and then the auger should just slide off like that. Now what we also want to do is provide something that won't nick or damage our shaft. I'm just going to use this old shirt, place it down there, and then using a paper towel, we're going to clean off our shaft. I'm going to use a product here. It's Permatex AntiSeize. Can you see that? This is a nickel-based AntiSeize, not copper-based. I don't want any galvanic corrosion happening on my shaft. And I'm going to apply a generous amount of this lubricant onto the shaft, and then even apply some AntiSeize onto the end piece and into the end bearing retaining hole for good measure, and slide your augers back on. And even give it a quick spin to spread it on the inside, and you can even repeat the application process if you want to ensure that everything is coated. Just to make life a little easier to do the other side, I'm going to loosely reinstall the shear bolt for this one side. Now, on my auger, there's actually a small hole right here. If you guys can see that, it's a small tiny hole. That's actually where the bolt head goes. And then on the opposite side of the auger, there's the larger portion right here. You can see it's sort of cut out. That's actually for the nut portion of the bolt. Just keep that in mind. And of course, before reinstalling my shear bolt, I'm going to go ahead and coat it with ample amounts of AntiSeize as well. Like that. Put that through and just screw that in by hand. And then we're going to do the same for the opposite side. So pull off the auger. Give it a good wipe. Now there are some folks that like to use grease over AntiSeize. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as you do it every year or every other year and just stay on top of it. It comes down to making sure that you have some protective barrier between the two pieces of steel. Once that's done, slide it on, spin it around one more time, coat the next shear bolt, line up my hole, and then install, and then loosely install my bolt. So I got one more bonus thing I'm going to do here to the inside of my blower box, is that I'm going to take some of this spray-on detailing wax, and I'm just going to give the insides here a good spraying. And the reason why is that, as crazy as this might sound, by applying a bit of automotive wax to the inside of your blower box, it actually prevents water and snow and dirt from sticking to the inside, which can help it dry faster, as well as improve the efficacy of how well your blower actually works, especially when you're dealing with really wet snow conditions. And this idea isn't anything new. I've actually got the idea off of a power equipment forum, where others have done the same and have reported that it does help. That should be good. Now, before we reinstall the auger into the blower housing, I also want to bring your attention here to the gearbox input shaft and the importance of also coating it thoroughly with ample amounts of AntiSeize. Just like the augers that can seize under the shaft, the impeller drive or power input shaft into the gearbox can also seize, although a lot rarer. I've seen it happen. So we're going to coat this with lots as well, including the bolt. So to install the auger back into the blower housing, we're going to go and just give our bearing end plates a quick wipe, make sure that they're clean, and then applying a little bit of extra AntiSeize on the end of the shafts, just slide the bearing plate back onto the end of the augers. Now, once our bearing plates are installed, we can carefully manipulate this auger back into the blower housing and then line up the impellers drive shaft onto the gearbox. Just kind of slide that on carefully. Now what we're going to do is we're going to loosely line up this bearing backer plate with the holes on the outside of the blower housing to reattach the three 10mm securing screws to hold the bearing in place. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that, again, like any bolt on a unit, we want to coat it with a little bit of AntiSeize on the threads, and then using our hands kind of rotate and shift as needed to screw everything back together. Again, loosely installing first so things line up properly. Repeat the same for the other side. Just hand tighten the bearing plate bolts. You don't have to be very tight. Just snug is sufficient. They're only 10mm screws, so just keep that in mind. If you over torque them, you risk stripping or damaging the bolts. Now we're going to go ahead and install the impeller drive shaft bolt. We're going to be able to do this just simply by rotating this impeller such that it lines up the hole on the gearbox shaft. And so once we've done that, go ahead and thoroughly coat your bolt with AntiSeize and then pass that through. Give things a little wiggle and it should just drop right in. And then tighten with your 12mm wrench and ratchet. Just finger tight is actually all it's needed, because they're designed to break and you don't want to pinch this shaft right here. Next, go ahead and tighten down the auger drive shaft bolt and nut in the same manner as we did with the impeller. Again, just finger tight. These bolts will break if you over tighten them. And last but not least, we're going to reinstall the auger end bearing plate retaining screw and washer. Again, coating everything with a bit of AntiSeize. You can put a bit of AntiSeize inside the bearing race here where the shaft passes through. And then just giving it a tightening to make it snug. Now you may need to hold the auger with your opposite hand just to prevent rotating, but again, it's just snug. It doesn't have to be too tight. Repeat the same for the other side. Take a rag and sort of clean up any of the excess AntiSeize on the sides of the unit. And conversely, you can sort of wipe off any excess AntiSeize along this auger housing seal here. So as you can see from my video, servicing the auger drive protection system is neither difficult and not time consuming, and can be done with some basic hand tools and just a little bit of AntiSeize lubricant. I hope you found this video useful and informative. Give me a thumbs up if you like my video and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.